Our series this month, in the month of April, is titled This Thing Called You. And in recognition of the Easter holiday today, today's topic is entitled Easter from a Metaphysical Perspective, which, as you know, Science of Mind, the Centers for Spiritual Living, are metaphysical or new thought organizations. We are global in our reach. Our international headquarters are in Golden, Colorado. And we have approximately 100 million members throughout the world at the present moment. If you have more information that you'd like to get, you can go on our home website for the international centers, and that address is CSL.org. Pretty easy to remember. Ours is CSLWH for West Hawaii.org, and get any of 100 or more different feed-ins to what our organization is, what we teach, and why we're here. So, because regardless of our attachment to or distance from the celebration of this holiday, Easter, as religious, there's also the celebration of the chance to dress up, to dye eggs, to hide them, to find them, and then to eat them. There's the opportunity to gather with friends and loved ones, to barbecue, to offer a toast, to talk story. And as always, there is an assortment of histories about this holiday called Easter. For one thing, Easter could be referred to as a movable feast, says April Holloway, who is a metaphysical writer. She says it was chosen to correspond with the first Sunday following the full moon after the March equinox. Kind of sounds like talk story, doesn't it? It happens every month, but it sort of has its own legs as to when in the month and in relationship to the full moon. So this movable feast of which she speaks occurs on different dates around the world, since Western churches, meaning in the Western Hemisphere, use the Gregorian calendar, while Eastern churches in the Eastern Hemisphere use the Julian calendar. So there's another thing that has an impact on why Easter seems to be so erratic in when it occurs, unlike Christmas, for example, which always comes on the 25th of December. So most historians, April continues, including biblical scholars, agree that Easter was originally a pagan festival. The word Easter is actually of Saxon origin, according to the New Unger's Bible Dictionary. And it's taken from the name of Eastra, E-A-S-T-R-A, the goddess of spring, in whose honor sacrifices were offered around Passover time, which of course is a Jewish holiday, as you know. It wasn't until sometime in the 8th century of the modern era, what we call the modern era, A.D., that Anglo-Saxons adopted the name Easter to designate their celebration of Jesus' resurrection from death. It's of note for us to understand that, like many religious holidays celebrated in current times, there's a history going back into varied cultures of celebrations resembling a myriad of secular occurrences and events. We've already talked about that here where Christmas is concerned, and some of the other holidays that come along and how they have morphed into what they are today, which is very different from what they were originally and the varied sources from which they occurred. According to some theological schools and scholars, including Dr. Tony Nugent, The Easter story comes from even further back in history. He refers to the Sumerian legend of Tammuz and his wife Ishtar, dating clear back to 2100 BCE, which is known in the Christian calendar as BC. This story of greater length and detail is a fascinating one from which we find many details of the story of Jesus' crucifixion, entombment, and resurrection, which occurred 2 centuries later in time than the original story back in the Sumerian legend. Now, I tell you these stories in order to draw your attention to the fact that in life, as we study it in metaphysics, we inevitably find not only ourselves as an individual, a combined effort of our own past, but that what we have been taught is a combination of beliefs, of events, and ritual passed down through generations of many cultures, each of which may have modified those beliefs for various reasons. One could do an enormously lengthy treatise on this story alone, the one that I mentioned coming from the Sumerian legend. However, it's not my intention to do that this morning, and I can already see relief on your faces that it isn't so, because we too have a gathering of our spiritual ohana, our family, following the service to celebrate this opportunity to be together in fellowship. What is my intention, though, is to explore with you some of the metaphysical meanings that we have considered regarding the 3 facets of Easter from the viewpoint of Christianity. I've used several sources in doing this, and I'm certain there are countless others. You may be content with what I've found, or you may wish to pursue this further on your own. So let me share some of the ideas about this with you from a talk by Reverend Douglas Bortroff. He was a Unity minister. The first facet I want to address is actually a compilation of what some have identified as the arrest, the trial, and the execution in the life of Jesus. In Science of Mind, metaphysically, we would address this as that time when we have chosen to work on something new, a greater good, if you will, in our lives. And in so doing, find ourselves arrested by negative thoughts and appearances. That's to say, held in captive by our own hesitation. The second facet of our need to let go of or to die to old fears and attitudes. From this letting go, then, the new can be born. And for those of you who've taken some of our accredited classes, you've heard me speak of the process of chemicalization as put forth by Catherine Ponder, who is a Unity minister, talking about in order to bring newness into our lives, it's necessary for us to let go of the old, and in the process, there is created a void where the old is gone and the new has not yet solidified in our consciousness. And that's exactly what Reverend Douglas was talking about in this instance. So the first facet is to address what we need or want to let go of, the old, and in the process die to those old ideas. The second, to select something to work on, which is the arrest, when we feel ourselves made captive by negative thoughts and appearances. The second facet then is to let go of, to let die. those old fears and attitudes so the new can be born. And then the third facet is the ascending into a higher state of living as the new unfolds in our lives. And this is reflected in body, mind, and spirit. This is that ascension in a metaphysical sense. So to those of us who base our understanding of God as unconditional love, we see a deeper meaning to this story, one that is in keeping with the principle of growth and new life, which we often call this thing called you. I also have a fascinating story to share with you from the Global Center for Spiritual Practice. This is new information for me, and one which echoes for me that frequently identified misquotes or incorrect translations of information are passed down through many years and many generations. At one point in the story of the so-called execution of Jesus, he has been quoted as saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" It's a pretty well-known quote. However, now it's been determined that the words attributed to Jesus and spoken were in the original Aramaic, which is the language that has been identified as the language Jesus spoke. And it truly translates as, my God, it is for this purpose I have come." I don't know about you, but that gives me chicken skin when I hear that. So when we take these three facets that I've just shared with you moments ago, the first being that when we choose to work on something new, a greater good, if you will, in our lives, we sometimes find ourselves arrested by negative thoughts and appearances, or to feel that we are being held captive by our own hesitation. The second, our need to let go of or die to old fears and attitudes, and from this letting go then, the new can be born. And then the third facet, the ascending of a new higher state of living as the new unfolds in our lives, reflected in body, mind, and spirit. So from a metaphysical perspective, we get such valuable, lasting encouragement and direction. For those of us who find much in biblical and other philosophical writings that draw our attention, we begin to realize that the deeper meanings, the lasting meanings, can and must be applied in ways that support the purpose for which each of us has come here to be. We're all here to recognize, to develop, and to actualize our own innate divinity. We've all come to recognize, develop, and actualize our own Christ consciousness. Well, part of that work means understanding the true message of Easter, the understanding between Jesus the Christ, and Christ. So if you go to chapter 22 of the Science of Mind text by Ernest Holmes, which is one of the textbooks we use in our accredited classes, this chapter 22 is titled Finding the Christ. And it's a magnificent roadmap for us to understand that. Oh, and by the way, those of you who have studied this whole saga of Jesus' journey, you may remember that when he did return after the resurrection, you may remember that some of his friends didn't even recognize him. Because like the new spring flowers, he was the same and not the same. The previous had died away, and the new version was glorious to the point of not even being recognizable as the old. These metaphysical words come from Reverend Edward Villon, who is one of our Science of Mind ministers presently serving in Santa Rosa, California. And it's precisely what we teach and what we learn in Science of Mind in our own spiritual path of unfolding. That sometimes as we morph, if you will, the old drops away in a number of ways, including some who no longer recognize you for who you have become as compared to who you once were. Often those same people will be hungry to know what you know. Others would prefer to stay where they are in consciousness, and so that changes your relationship with them. That's not a negative thing. That's positive for both individuals to recognize where they are in consciousness and how that is unfolding in their passage through this plane of existence. So let me say this too. Literal stories in religion often have a tendency to be about sin, punishment, damnation. In metaphysics, we always tend toward the good. It's unfolding and its constant presence of a loving God within, around, and through us. And because, as creations of the Most High, we have the choice of which of those we choose. Of which of those we choose to choose. So, whether Easter is observed as a religious holiday or a time for families in the Northern Hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, to enjoy the coming of spring and celebrate the decorating of eggs and Easter bunnies, the celebration still retains the same spirit of rebirth and renewal as it has for hundreds of years. And so it is.
So it is.